Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and now, in fact, our only show of the weekend. We are following this one up today with another one, similar time of day tomorrow, when we are exploring, in fact, in greater detail, one of the topics we are tackling today, at the Alexandra Hospital in Singapore. But here we are. It's still Footsteps in the Pacific Week, and today we are looking at events that were happening basically 80 years ago this week, the Japanese attack and successful conquest of Singapore. So there were two guests, one of whom has joined us live, who is presenting the show today, and one who submitted his contributions via video on location yesterday. So I'll first of all acknowledge Professor Brian Farrell, who wrote this incredible book, probably the definitive book about the defense and fall of Singapore. Professor Brian Farrell, a Canadian who lives and works in Singapore. So he has provided video segments for us. But then I'm hosting, driving the show in terms of the History Today live for us, Lieutenant Colonel Ross Cable, who I first met in person having a Guinness at a pub in Bayeux, which is rather cool. So he's going to be driving the actual historical discussion as we go forward today. And then, folks, please jump in with questions and comments, and we can do big questions at the end, little ones as we go along. If you are new to World War II TV, perhaps this is your first live stream, because where you live in the world, it's a time you can be available. Welcome along, and please, if you haven't already, click subscribe, click the little bell so you receive notifications, and maybe consider becoming a YouTube channel member and or patron. But without further ado, I'm going to bring Ross in. He's waiting patiently. So good morning, Ross. How are you doing?
G'day, Woody. I'm great today. How are you?
I'm very well. It's an odd time of day to be doing it, but it's good, and we've got people here watching, so that's great. So you're an Australian, battlefield staff rides around the world, but you're in Europe right now, but obviously the Far East draws you in. When you visit the battlefields of places like Singapore and what we would, Malaya, but now Malaysia, what is it about visiting those sites that kind of rocks your world, so to speak, compared to the ETO? What is it about the Pacific that intrigues you?
Well, I think the first thing about these battlefields is that they're quite unknown. You're very familiar with Normandy. There are literally hundreds of books there. You go to all the sites. There's generally signposts anywhere you go. Not everywhere, but anywhere you go. And it's all pretty well known and pretty easy to interpret. Whereas you go to some of these places in Malaysia, in particular, and there's often nothing. There's some volunteer groups seeking to rectify that. You'll find some of these guys on Facebook doing some great work. But generally speaking, they're pretty hard to interpret. The histories are not well known. And it's just as much investigation as it is visiting. So that's what I really enjoy about it.
And we've just already had a comment coming in from someone saying how important this is for the current Malay regiment. And again, we often talk about it on World War II TV, that we focus on these battles from our nation's participation. So being a Brit from East Anglia, I think about the Brits from my part of the country that ended up in the bag, taken prisoners. If you're Australian, your interest maybe comes via Australian regiments. But if you're from Malaysia, then, of course, your interest is going to come via the local contingents. And we've got, of course, Indian Army presence there as well. So very international. Everybody has their slight different areas of interest and what kind of moves them and what drives the history within their country. But basically, without further ado, we're going to get on with the show. So, folks, what we have is, as I say, Ross is going to be driving the presentation with his PowerPoint. And then we have 7 clips of Professor Farrell on location that he recorded yesterday that I was still editing and getting ready last night. So not like we're not prepared or anything, but it's all ready to go now. So I'm going to load up Ross's PowerPoint and basically we're good to go. So don't forget, folks, as I said there, this is all happening 80 years ago this week. So over to you, Ross, and then I will be jumping in with my usual questions. And folks, if you have your questions, please fire away. So here we go.
Rightio. So what I'll cover first is a brief introduction. I'll set the scene, and then I will basically show you how the initial invasion, which occurred in the Australian sector, then shaped the battle, then shaped down to where the final perimeter was set, of which Pasir Panjang Ridge features in the southernmost portion. So I'll take you on that journey to get you to that location. And probably best I go through it in as simple form as possible, and then we come back for any questions. Now, of course, there's a range of considerations that come in for this entire battle. Of course, the battle was part of a broader, the Malayan Campaign. It can't be divorced from that at all. And then, of course, part of the operational theatre, which included Pearl Harbor, which included fighting at this time in the Philippines, and then it's set in the strategic context. I went into the strategic context a lot more last time, but let's remember that this was priority 5 for the British nation on a strategic level, and that definitely plays out in what resources were available for this battle. And of course, we have the simplistic notions in military history. Often there's no simple explanation for these things. It's not just the guns facing in the wrong direction. It's a complete series of shortcomings. Some of the seeds of this defeat were sown decades prior. They were constructing this naval base. The naval base would obviously need protection, and they didn't do what it took at that time for the comprehensive protection of that base. Command competence comes into this. And what we'll really see is the Japanese commander, Yamashita in particular, demonstrating marked competence, whereas Percival is well open to criticism. And of course, remember, the British had superior numbers. But superior numbers alone do not deliver victory, as we'll definitely see here. The Japanese, in terms of warfighting skill, were far, far more competent than the British with their superior numbers, and in some cases resources such as artillery ammunition. And the entire strategy, as well as being flawed, was quite disjointed. You'll see the lack of cooperation between units and brigades. And it was also very demoralising for the troops. Morale and the willingness to fight was definitely starting to crumble at a very early stage.
I mean, just to jump in a bit, Ross, I mean, I think even in the UK or in Australia, people would have been aware of the quote-unquote Singapore plan, so would have had confidence that there was some kind of system in place to deal with something, and because that had been a sort of a buzz phrase for as you say, years before 1941-42. So I think having confidence in something, if everybody's talking about it, it's a bit like the Maginot Line in the sense that people have this idea of this broad strategy. They don't understand the minutiae of it, but they've got confidence in it.
Absolutely, and it was often referred to as the Singapore Fortress, and that was a complete misnomer, as you'll see. But as we covered in the last presentation on Malaya, and I remember Professor Farrell speaking about this, it's that oh, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
It happens to me all the time. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Where was I going with this? Yeah, at quite an early stage, the Australian government in particular was demanding greater assurance on the defence of Singapore and starting to ask for its own troops back. Remember, there's 3 Australian divisions in the Middle East at this time, and we want them back to support our own national objectives, which is protection of Australia. And we got reassurances by people like Churchill. Basically, it's all going to be okay. We've got it covered, and clearly it wasn't. And Churchill, who wrote much of his own history, feigned surprise at this naked island. And I personally think no one should have been surprised less by how it went. But that's something of a different story.
Yeah.
But of course, why Singapore? And we'll just cover some old ground here. Singapore occupies a highly strategic position, both in terms of waterways and its position in Asia. And the British, in maintaining their empire, came up with what they call the Singapore strategy, which was using Singapore as effectively their power base in Asia. And the hub of this power base, the centre of gravity, was the naval base. And you can see a photograph on the screen of the naval base here. The docking facilities in particular were absolutely essential if you want to maintain a battle fleet in this region. That's why it was so important. But of course, to defend the naval base, you have to defend Malaya, and the fighting reached Singapore because of the convincing early defeat of the British forces in Malaya, which obviously we spoke about last time. And I've touched on it already, but remember also that Singapore is part of a wider operational theatre. You know, in talking about the operational level of war, why can't we do more for Singapore? Well, it's because Pearl Harbor's effectively wrecked the US fleet. The US Army and US Army Air Forces are heavily pressed in the Philippines. Our own forces have been overrun in Hong Kong by Christmas. And, you know, India, Burma and India are under threat. And, of course, there's impending invasions, wider Japanese invasions into areas such as Borneo. And just on this point, it's like, well, why did the Australian 8th Division in Singapore only have 2 brigades, which we'll cover in detail today? Well, it's because the 3rd Brigade is penny-packeted across the islands of Rabaul, Timor and Ambon as part of this sort of tripwire for the outer islands of Australia. And we saw a few weeks ago in Rabaul, these forces are absolutely steamrolled. These individual battalion type groups are absolutely steamrolled. So the wider operational theatre is already having an effect on the course of this battle. And the final thing is prestige. You know, the British are very alert to the prestige of maintaining their crown jewel of their empire here. So when it all comes down to it, the politicians are arguing for continued fighting in Singapore well after the small fleet's destroyed, well after the dock is within machine gun range, basically on the basis of prestige. Okay, so I'll give you here some of the main points in Singapore that will become relevant for the battle here. So the basic dimensions of the island are 23 kilometres north to south and 40 kilometres from east to west. Or in other speak, that's 26 miles east to west and 14 miles north to south. The important things about this island, first of all, you'll notice at the top of the map, there's a waterway. That's called the Straits of Johor, and this is a very narrow waterway, down to around 1,000 metres, 1,000 yards in many places. And this was the waterway over which the Japanese had to assault. If we go from the top, you'll see the brown icon next to what looks like a small bridge. That bridge is called the Causeway, and the British sought to demolish that and severely damage that, not irreparably, of course, in their retreat. That brown icon next to the causeway is the Sultan of Johor's palace, which had a large tower in it, which was the world's most perfect observation post for artillery and the Japanese commander himself. To the right of that icon, you'll see the anchor. That's the Singapore Naval Base. You'll easily appreciate why, with the Japanese on the other side of a 1,000, 2,000 metre causeway, that is completely out of action. Then if you go to the south, or go below that tower, you'll see a cross. That is the location of the Kranji Commonwealth War Grave. And not many people are aware, but that was also one of the rear and headquarters company locations of one of the Australian battalions. So many tourists go up there now and don't realise it was actually a key point in the defence. Singapore has a number of high features. If you see the first green icon near the cemetery, that's Bukit Mandai, Bukit meaning hill or mountain, and that's about a 400 foot hill, so quite significant terrain. And below that's the largest feature in Singapore. It's Bukit Timah, which is about 100 feet higher. And the Bukit Timah area, there's a road called Bukit Timah. There's also a town called Bukit Timah. This will feature heavily in the fighting I'm going to go through. Now, you'll also see on the map 4 icons, which are small aircraft. These were once operational air bases, but the three in the northern side were out of action by the time of the invasion of Singapore. The one in the south that you can see just near the urban built-up area, the grey shaded area, is Kalang. That was the civilian airfield, but used to station fighters at the start of the battle. Of course, in this day, we didn't have the massive Changi airport, which is an enormous hub for the Asian region. But if you look to the right, very right of the slide and the right of the island, you'll see another brown icon, which looks like pillars. That's where Changi Jail was. That's where all the prisoners were eventually taken. It's still there. There's a very large airport beside it on reclaimed land, which there is a huge amount of in Singapore right now. Going again, coming back to the southern end of the island, you can see the shaded area, the urban area. That's the main city, which still exists and is vastly expanded today. And to the left of that, you'll see the brown icon with the small cross on it. That's the Alexandra Hospital, and it was a military hospital back then, surrounded also by barracks, which we'll visit a little later. And the green icon next to that, at the very bottom of the map, is Pasir Panjang Ridge, which Brian will take us to in the second half of this presentation. Now, on the left side of the map, which was the western area, you can see a couple of features that I've enhanced. Firstly, you'll see the two blue lines. They are two rivers, the Sungai Kranji in the north and the Sungai Jurong in the south. And that red line interconnecting them, it was a well-known pinch point called the switch line in some accounts, but was intended as a defensive line called the Jurong line, and that will become important in the fighting. The other blue elements I've marked on the map in the very centre are the reservoirs, and these are critical for Singapore's survival. Being a tropical country, you need a lot of water, and these were where the water was stored and critically brought in from Malaya. Just finishing off on the western side of the island, you can see the Tengah airfield there, and the two villages I've marked in there. The first one is Bullen, and the one on the far left to the north is Amakeng. So I'm covering these because I'll go through them during the presentation. The final things I've marked on the map are the brown line, which runs from the top of the map to the bottom. That's the railway line, and it's mainly important in this battle. Often it's referred to, but like a lot of railways, like you'd know in Normandy, there were embanked areas which features in the fighting. Right. The green line is the pipeline. So this is the pipeline for water from Malaya into Singapore. And although the water had stopped by this point, clearly the Japanese had an interest in stopping the water supply. That was another avenue of withdrawal for the troops. So, with that explained, we'll go into a little some of the more important terrain features. So we've covered the dimensions of the island, and obviously the we've got tropical climate there, and you'll see just how warm it is when Brian's on the ground. Tropical climate is most important here because it lends to high rainfall and tropical vegetation. So anything that's not cleared is rapidly regrown with secondary growth jungle. And as you saw from the map, there were various urban areas, a city in the southern end of the island, which was the capital, but also a number of villages of varying sizes. We've gone through the location of the rail line, the port, the naval base in the north. There's actually the civilian port is in the south near the city, actually near Pasir Panjang Ridge, and the airfields. Roads are actually important to this battle as well, and you'll see on the various maps I show the roads that link parts of the island. And these were, given that we've got pretty rough, often jungle country on sides of the roads. The roads are very important avenues of advance and focal points for defence. Covered water reservoirs. The next thing is about defensible terrain. I've mentioned some of these hills, and the thing is that Singapore does have some terrain that is defensible. And in the next slide, you can see one of these railway embankments right in the suburb, the modern day suburb of Bukit Timah. This is defensible if you want it to be. And then the other thing about the other really important part of the terrain feature, and being tropical, high rainfall. There's numerous rivers, there's creeks all around the place. This divides your defence up, complicates it, and also provides avenues for the enemy to infiltrate through. And on the very fringes, all around the coastline of Singapore, back in that day, and you'll see on this photo even today, particularly in the northwestern sector, you have mangroves. And here we can see one of the road ends that was defended by the 2nd 20th Battalion Australian Imperial Force, the AIF. And you'll see there's the mangroves here and a very short distance across the strait. So we're looking, the land you can see in the distance, the near distance is Malaysia. And you can see here another angle from this shot. This is the sector defended by the 2nd 20th Battalion and looking way down the coast. And you can just see how, firstly, it's very difficult mangrove country and a very narrow strait for which the Japanese had to cross. So in terms of the Japanese order of battle, they essentially had 3 divisions available to them, and they used all 3 divisions. They were reinforced by 2 regiments of tanks, 2 medium artillery regiments, and a heavy artillery regiment. The Japanese also had extensive air power and obviously held naval supremacy anywhere they wanted to exercise that in the surrounding waters. They also had specialist engineer and crossing regiments, and they would be in charge of the boats and pontoons, which brought the Japanese forces across. So 3 Japanese divisions is the key one. The British, on paper, had even more. And the largest force was the 3rd Indian Corps. And I say remnants because this was the force that had met the Japanese right up on the Thai border and had been fought and punished all the way down the peninsula. But the 3rd Corps still remained as an entity and had received some reinforcements. The British also had the 18th Infantry Division, and I say light because it lost much of its heavy equipment when the Empress of Asia was sunk just prior to this battle. So essential things such as anti-tank guns went down with that ship. The 8th Australian Division was another coherent force that had received some losses in the fighting in Malaya, and we've gone into why I've said that's a division minus. It was less 1 brigade. The 44th Indian Brigade had landed as part of the reinforcements, and that was a coherent formation that had been untested in battle at this time on the southern coast. There were 5 battalions of local and fortress troops, which included the Malaya Brigade, and these were all located down on the south coast, and as you'll see, in some pretty decent positions. And there were also local reserves raised. So there were, for instance, a Chinese unit called Dal Force, which was employed near the Australian position. And one thing that the British had quite a lot of was anti-aircraft artillery. They had around 150 guns, which kept the Japanese, generally kept them bombing at a greater height. So the Japanese couldn't operate with impunity, but again, it's only a part of the air defence picture. And artillery, they had 226 guns, which was quite lavish, to be honest. Now, again, let's just cover off on other important details. Of course, the Royal Navy, with augmentation from the Royal Australian Navy, of course, had suffered the great defeat of the loss of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. And in terms of the defence of Singapore, only patrol boats were available for defensive action. Destroyers were being employed on other duties, namely the evacuation convoys from Singapore Island. And the coastal guns, of course, provided part of the naval picture. And we can't forget that the coastal guns were highly effective in deterring a seaward assault. The Japanese never contemplated assaulting Singapore from the south because of these famous coastal guns.
Right.
In terms of air power, a number of air forces were involved. The troops didn't all see what was going on, but there were some deeper bombing missions, including by the US Army Air Force at the time. You also had some Dutch forces performing, and you had both RAF, Royal Australian Air Force, and New Zealand Air Force fighter squadrons, which was important. As mentioned, only Kelang Air Base was operational by the start of the battle, and that was in the south of the island, and only 8 Hurricanes were stationed there by that time. And in effect, the Japanese held complete air supremacy. So in terms of getting joint effects, the British had none. They had effectively a ground force and no integrated joint force available to them. So when you're looking for simple causes for their defeat, this was one of them. Here's another cause. I touched on it before. I won't go through it in huge detail, but you had a hugely competent driving commander, Yamashita, and you had Percival, who made some quite weak command decisions all through the campaign.
He's not going to come in anybody's top 10 generals of World War II lists, is he, Percival?
No, absolutely not. Nice guy apparently, but not the driving commander you wanted. But that's also not to say some of the alternatives were better. We spoke at some length about Gordon Bennett last time, and while he was favoured by some and had a very different pugnacious approach, he was by no means any more effective. Command turbulence is a real issue, and I'm looking at a table here of the various Australian battalions, and we had some. This is how you don't, in effect, how you don't do command. Some of them or make decisions about command, but much of this was unavoidable. So the 6 original battalions, only Arthur Varley commanded his battalion from the start of the campaign to the end. The 2nd 19th, that was the famous battalion commanded by Anderson VC MC, and he was taken to hospital just before the battle. And so one of the company commanders from the 20th battalion was appointed to command his battalion. So he didn't even come from the same battalion, and at the 11th hour took command of the 2nd 19th. We also had, in terms of command turbulence, the death of a commander is also a bad thing. And what we see very early in the battle, within the first 3 days, is a number of commanding officers, COs, being killed. So we see here Asherton, a competent commander, however, killed in the first day of fighting. The 22nd, 26th, due to some favouritism, Oakes was appointed to command. Again, he came from the 19th Battalion. He wasn't being raised to command in the 26th, and he was given command of the 26th Battalion. The 29th, this was the battalion that was effectively annihilated in the fighting at Muar and Bakri. The CO was killed during that fighting, and the brigade major was appointed to command that battalion. The 2nd 30th, the famous one from Gamas, had the hard-driving Galligan in charge, and he too was taken to hospital literally the night before the battle. And thankfully, in this case, his second in command was appointed to command. Of the reinforcements, the 2nd 4th Machine Gun Battalion, the CO was killed after a couple of days of fighting. but this was, as we'll see, dispersed amongst the various battalions. And then you had at least 2 scratch battalions formed, and one of those COs, who'd actually been CO of the 2nd 26th, was killed during the fighting as well. So a huge range of command turbulence issues. In terms of preparation, the Japanese had spent their week or so after finally capturing Malaya, reinforcing. And the most important things they did was bring in landing craft for the assault. They had some specialized craft for this. And they also reinforced with the artillery. So they had extremely heavy artillery with adequate, as it turned out, ammunition for the assault. The British defences, you can write a whole thesis on this, but in a word, they were underprepared. That entire north coast that was facing Malaya and looked so obvious to the layman that you need to defend this was basically unprepared for defence. And whereas had the war effort worked more effectively, had the various leaders, including Percival, been more forceful, they would have done things like drafted greater amounts of civilian labour to actually start digging trenches, digging anti-tank ditches, making more elaborate defences. But that wasn't done. So many of these battalions are arriving in these swampy positions and starting to have to build defences from scratch. This is not a great way to defend an island. Also, there wasn't a good destruction policy. The naval base was still left in many ways intact. And again, there was these sort of last minute decisions made to destroy things. Unfortunately, however, the British successfully destroyed 1.5 million bottles of spirits that were held in stores there. So, they got the important things done. But important, again, in the destruction policy is there were a number of ammunition magazines. One was actually at Kranji, which you'll recall is in the north end of the island. Failing to destroy things such as ammunition magazines, just like we had in Malaya, they're Churchill supplies. They are free. That's free ammunition for the enemy. So this was not well handled. The British also had reinforced. They brought in the 18th Division, a British division, and that had arrived complete by the 5th of Feb. So really just on the eve that the final brigade had arrived. And you see a lot in the accounts about this being inappropriately trained for the desert. Be that as it may, they had arrived, they hadn't been able to acclimatise, they had to go straight to positions and start digging in. The 44th Indian Brigade had arrived, and you can see what the Indians looked like, and you can read quite a lot about how these Indians were prepared. The British Indian Army had been through a colossal rapid expansion. It had many young soldiers, many undertrained soldiers, and a lot of the officers, NCOs, etc., VCOs, as they had in India, had been dispersed to other units and formations to raise and train them. So you didn't even have the leavening effect of experienced troops and commanders. And one good unit, one well-trained unit that did arrive was the 2nd 4th Machine Gun Battalion. That was an Australian Imperial Force battalion, and they would play an important part in the defence. A number of, and also a number of individual replacements had arrived to fluff up these numbers, but this was really, I'll speak on the previous slide. This was a pretty bad situation. And now I can speak about the Australian case in a lot more detail, but these individual reinforcements were virtually untrained in some cases. There are literally some men who'd never held a rifle. There were guys who had never seen a Bren gun. And we're talking about significant reinforcements. 29th Battalion took 500 reinforcements in. virtually untrained. So if you're going to then use this as your reserve force, you're going to run into problems. In terms of the plan, the Japanese were bombing and shelling constantly, but the part of the brilliance of Yamashita is he came up with a deception plan. And we talk about deception plans a lot in the military. This is how you do it. And you actually have to resource these plans strongly. And he took, in effect, a third of his force, the Imperial Guards Division, and postured that on the northeastern coast. And that reinforced in Percival's mind that the Japanese were going to invade from the northeast, where he had positioned his freshest force, the 18th Division. And he also, made moves to reinforce this through, say, the artillery fire program and the appearance of trucks moving over there with headlights on. So, he had the deception plan was critical to his overall approach. Then, for the landing, he would assault with 2 divisions simultaneously, and then on the second night he would move the Imperial Guards back and assault on a different axis. And he wanted to generate tempo like he'd done in Malaya to effectively cut off and beat the British and Australian and Indian forces before getting into costly urban fighting in Singapore City. That was his plan. The British scheme of defence, as I just mentioned, they effectively strengthened to the northeast, and Percival's plan was to defend along the entire shoreline. And as the old military adage goes, if you defend everywhere, you defend nowhere. And this was the problems in taking such a defence were exacerbated by the terrain, which we'll come back to. Now, as part of, and this is what in the military we call an area defence strategy. And as part of this strategy, he formed both local and command reserves. So in the centre of the island, he positioned a command reserve, the Malay Command Reserve, which was the 12th Indian Infantry Brigade. Now, the 12th had been the brigade, the forward brigade at Slim River, and had effectively been destroyed. So he was placing his trump card on a brigade that had been severely damaged and had been reconstituted partially from reinforcements. The Corps Reserve, the 3rd Indian Corps, which was in the northeast of the island, also formed its own Corps Reserve, which was a brigade. The 15th Brigade, sometimes called the 9th 15th Brigade, because this was the one that was completely mauled in Jitra and had been amalgamated. 2 brigades had been amalgamated together. And then this brigade further fought down the peninsula, had been heavily engaged in Kampar. And again, this is what reliance was being placed upon. In the western sector, the Australian sector, run by the 8th Australian Division, the frontages were so great that the individual brigades could not generate their own, the division could not generate its own, the brigades could not generate their own reserves. And the 8th Division reserved one of its, took one of its battalions and made that the reserve for that division. Now, the battalion selected was the 2nd 29th Battalion, which I've referred to before. This was the one that had been completely destroyed in Bakri. So this was, you can already see that the scheme of defence is on shaky ground. The further thing that exacerbated this was the lack of preparation of any type of fallback positions. He was committed to this area defence. We're going to defend the shoreline. Area defence is hold the line in layman's terms, and wasn't really contemplating fighting anywhere else. And you can see on this map, which comes from the British official history, it might be a bit hard to make out, but on the right-hand side of the map, you can see a serrated line, red line serrated, called the Serangoon line. This was a line identified but barely prepared as a defensive line. And similarly, and I talked about it before, you can see in slightly off the center of the map to the left, there's another serrated line called the Jurong line. And this was the one that was at that pinch point between the two rivers. Again, identified by all and sundry that this would be a really good place to defend, but barely prepared for defense. So I'll talk a little bit more about this western sector. So you can see the defence having been divided up with these red lines. You've got the northern area, which is really the northeast, the western area, which is the entire northwest and west of the island. You've got the reserve area in the centre and the southern area, which encompasses Pasir Panjang Ridge. In the western area, in the northwestern sector of that western area, you had the 27th Australian Brigade, and the frontages these battalions had to occupy were huge. The 2nd 20th Battalion, which if you can identify on the map the Kranji River, so there's the causeway coming across, and just slightly to the left of it, you got a wide river mouth. Everything to the left of that was 27th Brigade, and that ground was occupied by the 2nd 20th Battalion on a frontage of 7,000 yards, which is about 7 kilometres. And then the next two battalions going around the coastline towards the south had frontages of 3,500 yards each, which is about 3.5 kilometres. And then you got to the Indian 44th Brigade sector, which was not anticipated and was not invaded. So to maintain this frontage, the battalions put 3 companies forward and held one in reserve. And you also had a machine gun platoon, a Vickers machine gun platoon from the 2nd 4th AIF with each of these battalions. And they were your heavy firepower to engage the Japanese as they came across the strait. You also, on the mouth of the Kranji River, you also had a company of Dal Force, these Singaporean Chinese volunteers, and they were a locally raised and trained force that were mainly patrolling that infiltration route. You also had a Indian State Force battalion called the Jind Battalion in defence of the Tengah airfield, which you might be able to pick out on the map just to the left of those two lines, the Jurong line. We'll get more into that later. And then you also had, as I said, the reserve, the 2nd 29th Battalion, but held over towards the centre of the island, and that again was tasked. The thing you should definitely do in military terms is not task your reserve if it's going to be used as a dedicated reserve, but it was tasked. Now, as I said, the terrain in the northwest sector was unsuitable for area defence. And I thought it might be easy to draw the analogy of Omaha Beach. This is the opposite situation to Omaha Beach in almost every respect. You had no prepared or concrete positions. It was very swampy ground, which you could barely dig into, and soldiers had to often throw up breastworks rather than digging into the ground. What's the effect of the mangroves? Well, firstly, it restricts your visibility, which means you have difficulty firing at the enemy. You have restricted fields of fire, and you have difficulty maintaining mutual support and gaining interlocking arcs for your machine guns. So as opposed to Omaha Beach, where all positions can fire in front of the other one, support each other, you can see well out to sea, you can see everything that's happening. Here, the opposite. And of course, Omaha Beach was in daylight. The Japanese, of course, decided prudently to come across at night. Much of the terrain, particularly as you worked around the coast to the south, was very swampy, and there were in effect islands in that swamp, which would dictate where your defensive positions would be, your platoon and your company positions. So much of the defense is shaped by this. And in amongst all these positions, between the battalions, you've got various creeks and rivers which give infiltration routes to the Japanese. You know, it's like having on Omaha Beach. You know, you can't go around defenses easily on Omaha Beach. Everything's defended. This is the opposite. The Japanese can get right behind your WN position and isolate you or destroy you in detail. And that definitely happened. And then behind these defensive positions, you have just a massive secondary growth jungle with very limited, very few roads and footpaths through the area to move around. So that's the area defense. What's the clear alternative to our area defense? It's mobile defense. And the actual Australian Army doctrinal case study for this used to be, as mentioned by one of your presenters in Armour Week, was the Battle of the Chir River in outside Stalingrad.
Yep.
And what made the Chir River such a great case study? Well, the advantages employed by the German forces there. They had excellent communications. You can maintain a thin line, a screen line of troops, get good information about where the enemies come through, and then you can respond to that due to your communications. You also have highly mobile forces, in that case panzer forces, that could move around at will. Whereas here, you have largely foot-based troops, very limited roads and things like that. And the Japanese, of course, have air superiority. They can bomb you while you're moving. The Germans had extremely well-trained troops, whereas we've seen here, we've got troops who are either undertrained or in some cases leavened by reinforcements who are basically untrained completely. And you've got to do rehearsals. You've got to train and be rehearsed for what are some very difficult missions. Respond to a position we might not have been to before and conduct an attack on the enemy. This is what you do with highly trained troops, not reinforced battalions or scratch battalions like the X battalion raised from supply troops and that sort of thing. And of course, in defense, you always want to have a greater than, to attack a defended position, you want to have a greater than 3-to-1 ratio. So we'll see how that goes in the attack. There's a famous photo of the 2nd 30th Battalion defending the causeway. And then we get to the invasion itself. So in this very northwest of the western sector, on the night of the 9th of February 1942, the Japanese invade and they hit this Australian brigade, the 22nd Brigade. I think I made a mistake with that before. 22nd Brigade, they hit that hard. The initial wave has 16 battalions, and the weight of the attack falls pretty much on not exclusively, but pretty much on 2 Australian battalions. So immediately you see the Japanese have generated the force ratio required to do this. Now, the Japanese also set clear objectives, which is a real principle of war here. They know exactly what they're going to go for. They don't need good further communication and coordination. They are going for the objective of that Tenga airfield, which you can see towards the bottom right of the screen. And they conduct their operations after the assault with characteristic aggression, but also use of infiltration. They're not going for the destruction of the Australian force per se. They are heading for their objectives, and they know they will create a huge amount of disruption in doing so. The invasion itself was preceded by incredibly intense artillery fire, described by Colonel Varley, the commander of the 18th Battalion, which is in the centre of the Australian position. You can see the goose eggs there, the large one in the centre.
Yep.
He was a World War I veteran and described the artillery fire as being heavier than he'd experienced in the First War. And then the Japanese fire cut out, and they assaulted across. Now, the story you can read in Australia's magnificent official history, which is available for free in its entirety in the Australian War Memorial website, and there's some accounts of very heavy fighting here. The Japanese often would make crossings. The Australians had great difficulty illuminating part of the battlefield with their beach defence lights. They couldn't see everywhere the Japanese were coming across.
I did that a couple of days ago, Ross, in a show, so I'm glad I'm not the only one now.
Yeah.
I'm an ETO guy, and you're in the ETO, so that's my excuse. But I dropped to Germans in the middle of a talk on Peleliu, so
yeah, right.
Easily done.
There was a case of the Germans being in Okinawa, but that's a different story. But yeah, they came across, and it was a real debacle. Basically, there was in effect the companies were fighting isolated battles. They had the Japanese artillery had cut most of the communications back to the artillery gun batteries, which had registered fire missions. The emergency very lights, which they were going to fire to signal to the guns to fire, they were often waterlogged and wouldn't fire, wouldn't fit in the pistol. All sorts of debacles of this nature. But again, at the same time, some scenes of very heavy fighting. So in the very northern position, you can see that the various goose eggs there in the 2nd 20th Battalion location. You have accounts where these Vickers guns would fire off their entire allocation of 10,000 rounds of ammunition, and would report gaining mass casualties on the Japanese as they crossed the water. The fighting became very severe with some machine gun, Vickers machine guns, accounts of them engaging the Japanese as close as 10 meters, gun crews fighting with bayonets. This is all at night, mind you. Down in the 2nd 18th Battalion sector, one of the machine gun privates in the machine gun crew actually bayoneted a Japanese officer, then grabbed his samurai sword and started killing all the other Japanese soldiers as they came in. So we're talking about extremely heavy fighting. And just due to weight of numbers, despite the casualties inflicted on the Japanese, the Australian companies began to be ordered back, or started falling back of their own volition. And again, some of them had to do fighting withdrawals, cases where machine gun crews were withdrawing and literally used the tripods of the machine gun to bash Japanese who had infiltrated around their positions, and also fighting at pistol range and that sort of thing. All the battalions eventually ended up trying to fall back on this village at the centre of the map called Amakeng, where there was another little pinch point between some rivers. They did this with significant difficulty. The 2nd 18th, which is that middle battalion, got to there reasonably intact. The 2nd 20th was cut off, at least for a period, and one of the companies didn't receive the order to withdraw, and they had to fight their own way back. And the 2nd 19th, in the south, despite not being on the brunt of the assault, was largely cut off, and only stragglers really made it back to the position. And that there was fighting for this Amakeng position, but eventually the troops and the Brigadier Taylor ordered his men back to what was called the Bullam line. So there was a small line at that village in the bottom right. You can see now some of the terrain here. This was up in the north, the 2nd 20th Brigade, 2nd 20th Battalion position. This was the kind of ground they were defending. And as you can see, there's a battle marker from the Singaporean government there, with one of my late great friends standing there, an Englishman whose wife's relatives, one of the relatives is buried at Kranji. This is some of the terrain through which the 2nd 20th Battalion did their fighting withdrawal. And you can see in Singapore, this is some of the most remote and original terrain, vegetation still there. So that you can get a good sense of what the fighting was like. Everything to the left of this road is actually Singaporean Army training areas. So you can't go in most of the Australian brigade positions because it's live firing ranges. I have, though, been in there once on a live fire exercise many years ago. So basically the Australian brigade falls back, the 22nd Brigade, that is, we've been discussing, falls back to the Bullam line, which you can see on the bottom of that screen. And the Japanese don't really attack that line through the rest of the 9th of February. That they've achieved their objective, their preliminary objective, Tenga Airfield, and they pause there. The next night, the night of the 9th and 10th of February, they attack the 2nd Australian Brigade, the 27th Brigade, which is on a much narrower frontage there near the causeway, and Krunji, which is the war grave. So if you see Krunji on the map there, and the various goose eggs, they've got 2 companies forward with their Vickers machine gun platoon, and the rearward goose egg on that is actually Krunji Military Cemetery, which gives amazing visibility over the entire ground. This was a very strong position, natural position, narrow, on a narrow frontage, and the Japanese assaulted that night. The Japanese could only go on a very narrow frontage themselves, and I think they only came across with a regiment. And the Australians again gave a very good account of themselves from the end of that road at Krunji. But controversial, there were also some oil tanks along the foreshore there, and the Australians were struggling to destroy these at literally not even the 11th hour. It's just, the Japanese are here. Let's get about this task of destroying the oil tanks. And eventually the Australian engineer officer manages to do this, and much of the burning oil burns hundreds of Japanese trying to infiltrate up one of these rivers, which should have actually been in the plan, you'd say. Then controversially, and I won't get into this, but the 27th Brigade, having inflicted decent casualties on the Japanese to the point of where the Imperial Guards Division commander is contemplating abandoning the attack, he then notes the Australian resistance slacks and he reinforces. And this gives him access to the entire trunk road, the Woodlands Road, and the rail line, which you can see going from the north to the south of the map. And it gives them a completely new axis of attack through Singapore. So on the 10th of February, what happens? Well, critically, in the very early hours of the 10th of February, just after midnight, Percival gives to his commanders what in effect was a warning order, operational order number 40. And this lays down basically the final defense perimeter of Singapore. And this has the effect of creating confusion amongst his brigade and divisional commanders, which is then to have marked effect on the next day's fighting. As part of, now the reserves which we'd seen had been constituted, Percival had finally ordered these reserves towards the west coast, and he actually positions him on this unprepared Jurong line. So you can see on the sketch map here, the goose eggs to the left near the airfield, that's on the Bullam line, and the ones on the right-hand side of the map running north to south, they're standing on the Jurong line. And Brigadier Taylor, without huge pressure, under orders, withdraws from the Bullam line. So they don't really fight for this position and inflict more casualties on the enemy. And then only the Jurong line stands. That's what the Bullam position looks like. It's nothing special. It's a slight rise in the ground from otherwise riverine and swampy terrain. So on the 10th in the afternoon, they're now standing on the Jurong line, and then there's some confusion on the Jurong line, and you can see that this line covers two roads running east to west. And some of the troops on the northern part of the road start withdrawing. There's confusion. Are we going to the final defence perimeter, or are we not? And Bennett, Major General Bennett, the Australian Divisional Commander, hears of this, and he orders a phased counterattack to regain this line, commencing on the night of the 10th of February, or early evening on the 10th of February, and continuing through the next day. But we'll see here that an effect is being generated by the Japanese by their operational tempo. And this is what military people call the OODA loop. The Japanese are now within the decision cycle of the Allied forces. And the Allied forces are making increasingly erroneous and irrelevant orders on the basis of secondhand and inaccurate information.
Right,
so
right.
before this counterattack to regain the line happens, the Japanese conduct a tank attack. The Japanese have not been sleeping. They've put one of their armoured regiments in on the northwestern coast, and they attack down the road from Bulan towards Bukit Panjang village. So that northern road you can see running through the centre of the map. And this absolutely shatters any defences in this area. And the Japanese tank attack, followed up by 2 battalions of infantry, then turns right on reaching the main road, the trunk road, Woodlands Road, and punches all the way down as far as Bukit Timah village. And this gets behind the entire Jurong line defence, and in effect allows them to link up with the Imperial Guards coming down from the north. You'll also notice on this map that the 27th Australian Brigade is still in positions arrayed along the north-south road after their withdrawal from Kranji. That's what the Jurong line looks like today. It's not a huge hill. It's not a great natural defensive position. You can't go in there because it's the Singaporean Army Training Command. That's the best we can do. And then you basically have, so by the night of the 10th, the Japanese have completely shattered the existing defence. And then for the next 2 days, we have in effect a series of skirmishes. There's a number of withdrawals happening because of all these units that have been bypassed on the Jurong line. Of course, the Australians to the north realise they've been cut off, and they seek to exfiltrate often down this pipeline, which is to the right of the map. There's the British constitute some ad hoc forces up to brigade strength. One's called Tom Force, and this actually puts in a successful counterattack back up the Woodlands Road, but only limited success in some areas, and then it's forced to withdraw. But of course, here's a brigade attack going in really on a Imperial Guards division, so it's not a sufficient weight of counterattack to make a difference. And then there's a lot of ad hoc resistance along this main road axis and to the sides of the road, with some great individual actions. There was a Australian Bren gun carrier platoon commander who was the son of a First World War Lieutenant General who did a harassing mission up and down the road and shot a lot of Japanese. But in effect, we've generated much of a static state here through very ad hoc measures. And then what you have is Percival actually issue the order to fall back. So his warning order in effect comes to fruition, not in all the places he anticipated, but they fall back to a final defensive position on the night of the 12th and 13th of February. So by that next morning, almost all forces have reached the line. Now, this is a complicated map, so we'll try not to go into it in huge detail. But the easiest thing to identify in this map is the large red blob in the centre. That is what becomes the Australian defensive position in the final defence of Singapore. And they almost maintain that exclusively. These formations are not cooperating well together. You can see that the front line as it was to the left of that that red blob. That's where they fell back from, and then the line coalesces to the south and southwest of the Australian position. First, you've got the 44th Indian Brigade, which had retreated from the west coast, and then on the very south, along the coastline, you have the 1st Malay Brigade, which occupied positions just forward of Pasir Panjang Ridge, which you might be able to identify on this map, running parallel to the coast. It's quite a long 4-kilometre or so ridgeline. You might be able to identify that. There's a terrain map of part of the ridge from just after the battle. And from this point, I will let Professor Farrell take over the explanation of fighting for this final defence line in the south, on the very south coast of Singapore Island.
Well, great job so far, Ross. So this is the first of our videos with Brian on site. So I'll load the first one up now. So please enjoy, everybody.
I'm Brian Farrell from the National University of Singapore. Paul, thanks very much for the chance to talk today about a battle that, frankly, I've lived on top of and worked on top of for the last 30 years or so. Battle of Pasir Panjang, 13th to 14th February 1942. One of the two final significant fights of the battle for Singapore in February 1942. And it unfolded along and astride a ridge by the same name, Pasir Panjang, Malay for white sands, right, that runs about 5 kilometers east to west, parallel with the shoreline of the Straits of Singapore, along the southwest coast of Singapore Island. And we're going to take you around several significant sites today to show you the ground and talk you through some of the significant features of that battle. But a note of caution right away, you're all going to have to work your imaginations pretty vigorously for this, because the post-1945 change in land use has all but transformed the ridge and the surrounding area along which this battle unfolded. In 1942, it was almost entirely a wooded, uninhabited ridgeline with some petrol storage tanks and a few minor military installations, particularly a chain of pillboxes facing south towards the coast. Today, the western half of the ridge is utterly dominated by the university at which I work, the main campus of the National University of Singapore, which is right over here to my right. And we're at the western end of the ridge. The street that we're on is now called Clementi Road, named after a pre-war governor of the Straits settlements. In 1942, it was named Reformatory Road, after a boys' reform school somewhat further to the north along the road. The road went over and down across the ridge on its western extremity. Along here to my right, down the slope about 1 kilometer, lies the old shoreline of the Straits of Singapore. And over here to my left, again sloping downwards, moving to the north, is the feature that faced the direction from which the Japanese 18th Division launched its attack. Directly behind me, this knoll on which the Mosque of the Royal Army now stands, obviously terraced and landscaped in the modern era, there was a hill feature on this knoll which marks the westernmost point of the ridge, which was the advanced fighting position of the principal Allied unit that defended the position along Pasir Panjang Ridge and engaged the Japanese 18th Division. That was the 1st Battalion of the Malay regiment. More on them later when we make another stop. A rifle platoon of 1st Malay were stationed on this hill knoll to detect and impede any Japanese attempt to move up and along the crest of the ridge. The ridge itself rises to a peak of about 230 feet, but generally has an easy slope anywhere between 80 and 150 feet. And at the time it was very heavily wooded. So the concern, quite justified, was that the Japanese infantry, if they got in amongst the close country of the wooded slope, would be able to push around and between defended positions and move behind them. On the forward-facing slope to my front, looking north, was the remainder of the rifle company whose platoon was stationed here on the hill on which now sits the mosque. Those two platoons were supported by a section of universal carriers mounting Bren guns that had found its way somehow in the chaos of the retreat from the northwest of the island from 8th Australian Division to team up temporarily with 1st Malays. The job of the rest of the company was to prevent any effort by the Japanese infantry to move through the close country of the front northern-facing slope of the ridge and get behind the main defensive position. The battle began here on the morning of Friday the 13th, February 1942, when Japanese elements advancing to contact from my left here, what is now a park and a housing estate belonging to the university, bumped into the Malay rifle platoon stationed on this knoll here. The Malay rifle platoon enjoyed one important advantage. They had the support of two 6-inch guns from the Labrador Park battery about 7 kilometers away down along the south coast to my right that were part of the coastal defense network that had been designed to protect the naval base on the north shore of the island. These 6-inch guns had quite an ample supply of high explosive ammunition, which of course was the best ordnance to use against advancing infantry. But one problem is that they had been sighted and oriented to defend against an attack from the sea. When the Japanese attack did come in, the 1st Malays, who'd been stationed along this part of the defenses of Singapore Island from almost the very beginning of the campaign, had to do a right wheel from facing south along the sea to facing west to block the Japanese advance. The two 6-inch guns of Labrador Park were able to bear on some part of the Japanese line of advance, but not all of it. And as we shall see at our next stop, that turned out to be a problem. The platoon up here on the knoll of the hill behind me fought quite hard for the bulk of the morning, enjoying the support of those two 6-inch guns and repelling at least 3 Japanese probes. But shortly after midday, according to their sketchy records, they were mortared out of the position by a preparatory bombardment from a Japanese mortar platoon covering an assault that was trying to flank the hill. According to a prearranged plan, the platoon commander signaled the company commander, who pulled him back along the ridge, giving up this position, from which the Japanese promptly wishboned the ridge. Rather than pushing up and along trying to reach the crest, they diverted left towards the north slope and right towards the south slope, probing and looking for weak spots in the network of positional defenses that 1st Malays had established, using the ridge as the basis of their defensive position. This is where it all began. So it's a set-piece positional fight at first, in which the Malay battalion enjoys some support from Bren carriers on the northern slope and from coastal defense guns a little bit farther down the shoreline. But they are up against significant odds. An entire brigade of the Japanese 18th Division, which has its own strong organic mortar support and artillery support assigned as well. By early afternoon, those Japanese elements that had pushed the Malay platoon off this little knoll were engaging the main body of the Malay regiment down the road further to the south along the shoreline. That's where we'll take you now.
I just want to say thank you to Professor Brian Farrell and Ted for going out and doing that filming for us yesterday. Just amazing stuff. But we're going to bring Ross back in now and carry on the story.
Oh, look, I think we can just pretty much roll through these videos. Brian's going to start taking us up onto, or in fact, he's going to take us to this pillbox next and describe some of the defences in this area, some of which were actually pre-war, and then he'll later take us up onto the ridge itself. So you'll see some of the original vegetation and terrain there, and then the final defensive position up on the ridge, and then he'll go further afield from that point. So I think we just run them through.
Okay, we'll do that. This first one starts silently, then when we get to the pillbox, the audio kicks in. And the audio was the worst on that first one. It's much better on these other ones. But this is just playing, to give you an idea of the sense of the location, as you said, that how much has changed these days.
Okay, here we are at our second spot. This is along the southern coastline of Singapore Island, along what was in 1942 the Coast Road, Pasir Panjang Road. And behind me now is one of 3 surviving Second World War pillboxes, part of the network of coastal defenses meant to protect the naval base on Singapore Island. This is the only pillbox that it was involved in the Battle of Pasir Panjang. We're about 2.5 kilometers away from our first site, the hill on which now stands the mosque. And the position that we're at now did not actually feature in the fighting during the Battle of Pasir Panjang on Friday, 13th of February, but is an important site for our explanation nonetheless. 3 points to make here. The fixed defenses, medium and heavy machine guns and British infantry tactics, and how these 2 things came together as part of the Battle of Pasir Panjang. One of the features of the fixed defenses of Singapore Island that was completed before the Japanese began the Pacific War in December 1941 was this network of medium and heavy machine gun pillboxes along the south and east coasts of Singapore Island. These were meant to stiffen the defenses that protected the coastal artillery to prevent them being cut out or knocked out by raiding parties, and or to make any assault from the sea more difficult. A whole network of them along the entire south coast of Singapore Island, some 35 kilometers at the time, had been completed, and up along the east coast as well. They were deployed in natural features that gave them the ability to bring fire down on any advancing enemy from at least 2 different positions. So they were set up in an overlapping and interlocked network. The pillbox behind me faces directly along Pasir Panjang Road, pointing west. It was positioned so as to catch an enfilade fire from the flank, from the side, any enemy infantry, read Japanese, landing from the sea and trying to move across Pasir Panjang and up towards the ridgeline, which is immediately to my right here. There would have been another pillbox at the bend in Pasir Panjang Road, about 400 meters to my front. And this pillbox would have been covering the blind spot in the rear of that one, just as there would have been another pillbox at the bend in the road about 250 meters to my left, which itself would have covered the blind spot to the rear of this pillbox. When fully manned, 2 30 caliber tripod mounted Vickers medium machine guns would have been deployed in a pillbox like this. Machine guns in British infantry tactics in the Second World War. Medium and heavy machine guns were considered a divisional weapon. So they were grouped together in a dedicated battalion, trained and equipped with medium machine guns as a division commander's asset. By February 1942, Malaya Command, defending Singapore Island, had 2 of these. One was a recently arrived Australian machine gun battalion, the 2nd 4th Australian Imperial Force, deployed with the 22nd and 27th Australian Brigades farther to the north. The other had been a part of the garrison of Singapore Island since the mid-1930s. This was the Manchester Regiment, 2nd Battalion, whose machine guns were distributed along the south coast here. The Manchester machine gun detachments worked with the rifle platoons of the Malay Regiment to prevent any Japanese attack from the sea to my left, and were therefore deployed to resist the Japanese attack when it came in from the west. This particular pillbox was not engaged by the Japanese because most of the heavy fighting on the first day of the battle, the 13th of February, took place down the road here to my front, farther to the west. Near the end of the afternoon, as we moved into the twilight and dusk time of day, the commanding officer of the 1st Malays, Lieutenant Colonel J.G. Andre, decided to break contact and retreat farther east to the eastern end of the ridge. And as he fell back from his forward positions along what had been Reformatory Road and along Pasir Panjang Road, the coast road right here, he scooped up and brought with him the rifle platoons and machine gun detachments that had been deployed in these pillboxes here. So this is one of the few and certainly the most visually stark footprints of the Battle of Pasir Panjang, but this one, as it happens, was not directly involved in the fighting. By the time the Japanese came through this area that I'm standing on now, it was overnight the 13th and 14th of February, Friday, Saturday, and the Malay regiment and their comrades from the Manchesters had hopped in their trucks or universal carriers, taken their machine guns with them, and pulled back farther to the east. For our third site here, this is going to be a rolling discussion because that's the only way we can do it. We're going to go down South Bonavista Road, as it's now called. We're now on the northern slope of the ridge. This road in 1942 was called the Gap, an older term used in British geography to refer to passes through high ground. And the Gap bisects Pasir Panjang Road, going from north to south, roughly in the middle of the ridge, marking the west and the east. Along this gap, as we'll call it, is the last remaining piece of ground that can still give you viewers an idea of what the battlefield was physically like in February 1942. There is still some jungle fringe here. It ranges from 20 to about 150 meters in depth on both sides of the road. So the point of this little excursion as we go south along the gap towards the high point of the ridge is that you'll see, as we drive by, what the battlefield looked like in February 1942, absent all of the modern construction that you've had to put up with from now. So here we go. This is a snake of a road. There are 13 hairpin turns, used to be used for drag racing back in the wilder days. And you can see lining the road on both sides the jungle fringe. Quite shallow to the right on the western side, where the university campus is, rather deeper to the left on the eastern side, where the ridge is steeper as we move up towards the crest of the ridge, the apex of the ridge. So this gives you a far better indication of the kind of terrain that the Malay, British, and Australian soldiers fought in to try to prevent the advance of the Japanese 18th Division along this southern axis of advance towards Singapore City. And here we are in another one of these hairpins, jungle lining the road on both sides. And when we get to an access road, we will turn and climb the ridge to go up towards its apex, the site of the most dramatic engagement of the Battle of Pasir Panjang, which took place in the early morning hours of Saturday, the 14th of February. There's the access road on our left now, and now we're going to turn left and climb towards the apex of the ridge. See you up there. Right, now we're up at or near the apex of the ridge, near point 225, and the view behind me gives you an indication once again of the importance of high ground in general and of this ridge in particular. But I need to remind you, only the trees in the immediate downslope right behind me here give you some flavor of what all this looked like in 1942. Everything beyond them, All of those land features that you see down there, the housing, the container port facilities, all built on reclaimed land. None of that existed in 1942. This was all countryside to the west of the city. What you can also see, however, is part of the Straits of Singapore, there just beyond the container port. Near this point, at the top of the ridge, one rifle company had been left behind by Colonel Andre to set up a blocking position overnight to prevent what he knew would happen. A Japanese attempt to push along and over the ridge using the cover of darkness to try to infiltrate behind the new battalion defensive position that he was setting up farther to the east. This was C Company, and they were deployed in a company defensive position at the dominating crest of the ridge near a complex of petroleum storage tanks used by the Navy as part of the naval base facilities. You can see part of their position stretching out to my right here as it goes down the slope. This is probably the most well-known and dramatic part of the battle, because this particular company, around about dawn on the morning of the 14th of February, Saturday, 1942, was overrun by a Japanese attack. Now, in Japanese records, which are sparse, most of the Japanese documentation from February 1942 did not survive the war. What we have, mostly reconstructed after the fact post-war accounts, dismisses this fight in a sentence or two as a speed bump. But it's gone down in local lore as, greatly exaggerated, the defiant last stand of the Malay regiment. In part because the whole company was wiped out and annihilated. There were only 4 survivors. Also in part because all 4 men testified that one of their junior officers, a second lieutenant named Adnan Saidi, who had to take over the company when all his more senior officers were killed or wounded, manned a Bren gun and fought to the bitter end, fought to the death before he was killed by the Japanese. And post-war, for a whole variety of reasons, Adnan was inflated to the status of an almost mythical legendary hero, a Malay soldier holding a junior officer rank, defending his position in his country to the bitter end. I'll have more to say about Lieutenant Adnan, who certainly did his duty and fought to the death indeed, and also how and why what he did up on this ridge became such an important part of, frankly, post-war exaggeration. But there was a significant fight up here. C Company was overrun by the Japanese, it was wiped out, but in the process, it did buy enough time for Colonel Andre to regroup the rest of the battalion and get ready for that final Japanese onslaught that was coming later that morning. Okay, so I'm standing in front of a museum called Reflections at Bukit Chandu, an old pre-war house rebuilt after the war, taken over by the government and opened 20 years ago as a museum dedicated to the memory and the experience of the Malay regiment. Bukit Chandu translates as Opium Hill, a feature on the eastern end of the ridge, about a kilometer or so from where we just were at point 225, which reflects the fact that there was a pre-war government opium factory in the nearby site. The museum is here because it was the handiest possible site for the purpose of establishing a place at which the Malay regiment could be commemorated. Heart of the battle area over there to my front. I've been saying a great deal about the Malay regiment. Who were they? Malay regiment was first stood up in 1932 as an experimental rifle company. The experiment was deemed to be a success, so in 1936, the War Office authorized the raising of a full battalion and commissioned it into the British Army as the Malay Regiment, 1st Battalion. The Malay Regiment was a regiment in the British Army, whose personnel were recruited from the mainland on the Malay Peninsula and were almost entirely Malays, and unavoidably at first, all of the officers, senior and junior, were British. Junior NCOs were Malays, and the idea was that as time unfolded, and they advanced up the chain of command, they would become more senior officers and NCOs within the regiment. The roots of the Malay Regiment actually stretch back to the post-1857 theory that arose in the Indian Army regarding the so-called martial races. British rationalized to themselves that there were some races, quote unquote, who by virtue of their culture or character or characteristics were predisposed or naturally fitted to be good soldier material, whereas others were not. Now, by no coincidence, those districts that had produced battalions that remained loyal to the Indian Army in 1857 seemed to be good soldier material. Sikhs, Gurkhas, those regiments from Bengal, which had mutinied against the British Indian Army, were deemed not to be good soldier material. Part of the backwash of that is that in 20th century Malaya, there is this notion prevailing in the British and Indian armies that the Malays were a Pacific people unsuited by disposition to be soldiers. Of course, this was nonsense. Anybody can be trained to be a modern soldier, and a glance at pre-European contact Malay history would have indicated nothing but warfare punctuating what we know of that history. The experiment being a success, in 1940, a second battalion was authorized, but it had not been completed by the time of the outbreak of the Pacific War in December 1941. The first battalion had been, second battalion, 2 companies. 2 of the companies of the first battalion were very briefly sent up country to participate in the fighting in Johor in January 1942, but only saw slight engagement, small action. So pretty much the bulk of the action seen by the 1st Battalion Malay Regiment was here in the Battle of Pasir Panjang, which they saw as part of their country, Malaya, Singapore being at the time part of the larger Malay Peninsula world, although most of the troopers themselves were raised from the central Malayan state of Pahang. Second Lieutenant Adnan Saidi, the junior officer who took over the defense of Point 225, C Company's desperate attempt to prevent the Japanese advance along the crest of the ridge in the early morning hours of Saturday, the 14th of February, had begun life as an enlisted private soldier. He was evidently an extremely efficient private soldier. By 1937, he was a senior sergeant, and in fact, he was selected to be one of a party representing the armed forces deployed in Malaya at the coronation of King George VI. By 1941, he'd been commissioned into the officer ranks of the battalion as a second lieutenant. We really don't have much surviving documentation of the Malay Regiment. Of its war diary, we have fairly extensive pre-war notes, but from December 1941 onwards, the only thing that survives is a single page listing the nominal role of the officers of the battalion. We also have 2 accounts written by surviving officers of the battalion during the war while they were serving their time in captivity as prisoners of war. And there's a 1955 academic study published here in Singapore by Dol Ramley, which benefited from being able to interview a number of survivors of the battalion. More on that later. So the site behind me did not actually feature in the fighting on the crest of the ridge that early morning on Saturday, 14th February. But here is commemorated the role that the Malay Regiment played in the campaign, and that it played in building the basis of a post-war Malayan and then Malaysian army. The Malay Regiment, one of 2 battalions of Malaya Command, to be awarded a battle honor for the ultimately unsuccessful and, of course, disastrously failed attempt to defend Malaya and Singapore. The other was 2nd Battalion, Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. That battle honor is carried on the flag of the Malay Regiment today, and 1st Battalion Malay Regiment, in its wartime guise, is the parent father regiment of the modern Malaysian Army. Our second last stop, now we've moved to the eastern end of Pasir Panjang Ridge on the other side of Alexandra Road, and behind me, the last surviving of what were 9 barracks blocks built in the 1930s, 1936 for this one. There had been an army complex on and around this site since Atap Hut Barracks were built for an Indian Army garrison battalion in the 1890s. And in fact, on the other side of the road, that site had been the scene of a mutiny of half of the garrison battalion in 1915, the 5th Native Light Infantry. In 1936, these facilities were expanded and upgraded as the garrison was increased to bolster the defenses of the naval base. And deployed here in these barracks, the 2nd Battalion of the Loyal Regiment from North Lancashire, brigaded with the 1st Battalion of the Malay Regiment in 1st Malaya Brigade. The Loyals have the distinction of being the only regiment in the British Army which had to fight to defend their own place of residence, as on the morning of the 14th of February, Saturday, 1942, the last day of the Battle of Pasir Panjang, the Japanese advance crossed Alexandra Road and hit this position. There are some surviving buildings from the facility to my front here, miscellaneous administration and other buildings. But this barracks block behind me is the only surviving barracks block dedicated to rifle platoons. It's now used as an art gallery and an arts center. The Loyals and the 1st Malays were dispersed ultimately on the afternoon of February 14th, 1942, and pushed back towards Mount Faber, just to my left here, the last feature of high ground just on the outskirts of Singapore City itself, right next to the old port at Keppel Harbor. And here's a good place to summarize these two units. The Loyals saw some fighting up country, a little bit more extensive than the Malays had, but again, most of their action took place here on Singapore Island. The Malay regiment, Colonel Andre, who survived the battle, ordered his men on the evening of the 15th of February, the last day of the battle, when Malaya Command was poised to surrender, ordered his Malay troopers to doff their uniforms, put on civilian clothes, and disperse into the population and try and make it back safely to their families. A sensible and humane order which allowed some of them indeed to get away and recover their homes in the countryside in Malaya. And it speaks to the bond that made 1st Malays quite a strong unit. Andre and all the other British officers in the unit spoke fluent Malay and were very fond of their men and had built a very strong fighting team. And while the only chance they really had to show what they could do was this ultimately hopeless battle along the southwest coast of Singapore, the fight to defend Pasir Panjang Ridge, they gave a good enough account of themselves to justify the battle honor that they were given. Adnan Saidi, from all we know of him, from the sketchy evidence that we have of his last fight to the death atop the ridge on the night of the 13th and 14th, died a soldier's death. But it was necessary to create a usable past in post-war Malaya and Malaysia, and as happens in so many popular cultures, he was built up into a far larger-than-life figure. The suggestion being that it had been more of him and more Malay regiments, perhaps the Japanese, would never have been able to conquer Malaya and occupy Singapore. This is nonsense. The Japanese had strategic dominance of the entire region by February 1942. No matter who was present on Singapore Island in February 1942, they were going to be defeated. They were going to be put into the bag and surrender as prisoners of war. Nevertheless, the Malay regiment put up a perfectly creditable fight and made the attempt by Japanese 18th Division to push into Singapore City in their last advance a costly and difficult one, which ultimately failed. When Malaya Command capitulated, 1st Malaya Brigade still held fighting positions on Mount Faber outside the city along the Southern Coast Road.
Now, before we do the final clip, folks, I just want to spoiler alert, basically, because tomorrow's show, a similar time of day with Stuart Lloyd, is about an incident that occurred at the Alexandra Hospital at the end of this battle that Brian is going to do a very, very short version of now. So if you want to keep a bit of sort of surprise for the tomorrow's show, kind of don't watch the next 5 or 6 minutes. But honestly, we only cover it for about a minute here. The detail will come with Stuart Lloyd's presentation tomorrow. So bit of a spoiler alert. The events at Alexandra Hospital are being covered right now. But anyway, I'm going to load up the clip. If you don't want to hear this and wait for tomorrow's show, just kind of go out the room and have a cup of coffee, whatever you want. But anyway, final clip.
Behind me, a block, an original block from Alexandra Hospital, first built in 1936 to provide medical service to the British military garrison here in Singapore. Now part of the National University Hospital complex, only finally ceded by the British military when they withdrew from Singapore in 1971. This is our last stop, and the incident that took place here actually occurred in the sector being defended by the neighboring formation just to the north, 44th Indian Brigade. But what happened here is forever connected to the fighting along the Battle of Pasir Panjang Ridge, that fight put up by 1st Malaya Brigade, and will remain forever one of the more dramatic and horrifying incidents in the Malayan Campaign, the Battle for Singapore. It all has to do with the intensity of the fighting those last 3 days of the battle for Singapore itself, Friday the 13th through Sunday the 15th of February 1942. The connection to the coastal artillery is crucial here. When Japanese counter-bombardment and airstrikes knocked out those 2 6-inch guns at Labrador Park, one was destroyed, the other was spiked by its own gunners. That's what convinced Colonel Andre to pull back towards the eastern end of the ridge and regroup, having lost that important fire support from the 6-inch guns. But having regrouped around Alexandra Road, Andre benefited from the enormous stockpile of ammunition in the nearby magazine connected to Alexandra Barracks that was part of the stockpiles that had been built up before the Pacific War, when it was expected that Singapore would have to withstand a siege, the period before relief, before which the fleet was supposed to sail to the rescue. That had ultimately been designated to be 6 months, 180 days. So one of the things Malaya Command was not short of was ammunition, especially for its field artillery. This very much caught the Japanese off guard and by surprise, and the intensity of the fighting, particularly along Pasir Panjang Ridge and around Gilman Barracks, not only helps to explain why there's only one surviving barrack block there, but what happened here at Alexandra Hospital. Explain, not justify. There is no justification for what happened here. The 18th Division that led this advance along the South Coast Road, trying to push into Singapore City itself, raised from the southern island of Kyushu, particularly among tough coal miners in the coal mining districts of that island, had been set up deliberately by the commander of 25th Army, Lieutenant General Yamashita Tomoyuki, as part of a competitive race with its principal rival, the largest and strongest formation in Yamashita's army, the 5th Division. 5th Division was advancing along the main trunk road from the causeway into the center of the city, Bukit Timah Road. Moving parallel along this south road was 18th Division in what Yamashita had told both commanders was a race to see who would win the prize and the glory of being the first to penetrate into and overrun Singapore City. And 18th Division wanted that prize. 15th Division had really carried the load of the heavy fighting on the mainland. 18th Division, only one brigade of which had participated in the first month of the campaign, had landed on the east coast of Malaya and had advanced down the east coast and had not seen anywhere near as much or as significant fighting as 5th Division. 18th Division pushed hard to get into Singapore City, fought hard, took casualties, inflicted casualties. In the process of advancing on the morning of Saturday the 14th of February 1942, soldiers from the 44th Indian Brigade, retreating through the grounds of Alexandra Hospital behind me here, apparently fired on advancing elements of 18th Division, who were also under fire from guns supporting the Loyals and the Malay regiment 400 or 500 meters south to my right here. In what was deplorably familiar in the annals of the Imperial Japanese Army in the Second World War and in the Malayan Campaign, troops who found themselves in a punishing fight, taking heavy casualties, stoking their bloodlust up, sought retribution, ran amok, to use the local term, got completely out of control. On the afternoon of the 14th February, as the battle reached its height and Indian combat units retreated east towards the city, and the Loyals and the Malays fought for the barracks position just to the south, advanced elements of Japanese infantry moved into the hospital block and rampaged through it, literally slaughtering medical staff and patients, including bayoneting one unfortunate actually lying on the operating table itself. They then proceeded to round up much of the surviving medical staff, a couple of hundred at least, cram them into nurses' quarters out of sight behind this hospital block here, and in the course of the next morning, they began to murder them, 2 at a time, taking them out and machine gunning. That atrocity was only interrupted by a major bombardment unleashed by field artillery supporting the ongoing efforts of the Malay regiment and the Loyals to hold on to the Gilman position on the morning of Sunday the 15th. A near miss next to the nurses' quarters caved in the wall, and in the chaos, the Japanese having been killed, the survivors of that atrocity fled for their lives into the bush. This rampage punctuated a campaign in which the Japanese carried out such massacres on at least 3 occasions. That at Parit Salong in the state of Johor, here at Alexandra Hospital, and the worst, which was still yet to come, the roundup of suspect ethnically Chinese males in the so-called Sukching, or purification by elimination, which took place after the British capitulation. There is an explanation as to why 18th Division did this. There is, of course, no exculpation. But 18th Division, an experienced, well-equipped, well-led, and blooded Japanese formation, not only heavily outnumbered and ultimately even outgunned the 1st Malaya Brigade that they threw off Pasir Panjang Ridge, but also had the extra added motivation. While they encountered well-dug-in defenders stubbornly holding reasonably good defensive ground, who had a surprising to the Japanese, surprisingly generous amount of supporting artillery fire, the Japanese owned and dominated the air, had brought up a reasonable amount of their own firepower, and they could taste, sense, and see victory within their grasp. One more position, one more hill, one more push, one more afternoon, they were in the city and the campaign was over. The motivation was theirs.
Well, before I bring Ross back in to conclude today's show, I just want to extend again my hearty congratulations and thank you to Brian Farrell and Ted, his cameraman, for that incredible footage we got yesterday. And again, remind you folks, this book, The Defense and Fall of Singapore, is probably without the outstanding book on the subject. Brian's a Canadian living in Singapore, so it's kind of, he brings in every element of it, the British, Australian, the Malay. He lives there, he's been there for 30 years. So it's a really good all-round book, all points of view, Japanese point of view, where there are sources. So I recommend that with everything I can say to recommend it. So there we are. I'm gonna bring Ross back in now. So we're gonna conclude things off now. So that on the ground footage there was incredible, but let's bring the battle to an end now.
Yeah, well, of course, Professor Farrell is really the expert on this, and he literally works right next to the ridge and looks out on it every day. So, yeah, you've definitely got the best person to speak on this for you here. Just on the screen, you can see some pictures of the very famous lieutenant discussed by the professor. He is revered in the Royal Malay Regiment, which is closely allied to the Royal Australian Regiment and a number of British regiments to this day. And in their excellent museum up at Port Dickson, they have a big painting depicting the execution of Lieutenant Adnan. And they've even named their Malay-produced infantry fighting vehicle after this hero. Of course, we've been discussing one of the very final major battles of the entire campaign, and what we can see immediately after this battle, essentially on the 15th of February, 20-30 hours, is the surrender of Singapore. And Percival knew that, well, a whole range of factors were impacting. He was very concerned about the water supplies, not only were the Japanese starting to capture these reservoirs that I showed you at the start of the presentation, but a lot of the water mains were getting damaged by bombing and artillery. And so he's concerned about the civil population. The Japanese had captured much of the ammunition supply. So, you know, you can't fight on indefinitely without ammunition. We've got initial reports of atrocities. And then, of course, declining morale and discipline, which is a whole area to describe in itself. But how long can an army effectively continue to fight when it's suffered defeat after defeat and the enemy are just so close? And it just could not have gone on like this anymore. So he negotiated a surrender. Now, this is actually where the surrender occurred. It was negotiated in what's called the former Ford factory, which is now one of numerous museums you can visit pertaining to the war in Singapore. Of course, we all know the aftermath. approximately 130,000 Allied troops, probably about half of them Indian, but around 15,000 Australians, as a example, went into captivity with the Japanese. And pretty much everyone knows this. The nature of this captivity was brutal. The forces were initially marched over to the Changi prison, right on the east coast of Singapore, just near the modern day airport. And then they were used and variously shipped to other points. They had these horrific death ships that many troops just died on through poor treatment. Some of them were torpedoed by the Allies. Of course, big formations were sent up to the Thai-Burma Railway to work under utterly punishing and brutal conditions. And then at the end of the war, numerous prisoners were executed, well, throughout the war, but numerous troops were executed. Most famously, particularly for the Australians, was the Sandakan Death March, in which you'd probably say a brigade's worth of troops were marched and bayoneted until about six men survived. And there's a particularly poignant memorial room in the Australian War Memorial, which if you ever get a chance, you can go in and see and just realise the horrors of war. Of course, the Kranji Military Cemetery is where all the troops with known graves are buried. And just like in Europe, the Commonwealth War Grave, all the men who are missing are also listed on the walls. So you can see here, for example, the CO of the 2nd 4th Machine Gun Battalion, AIF, is recorded on this wall. His body was never found. I think he died up there on the Woodlands Road. So today, many things have changed in Singapore, yet many things stay the same. Pasir Panjang Ridge is now called Kent Ridge. As you could see, the ridge is part university and part parkland. You have the Bukit Chandau Remembrance Centre where Brian presented from, and it's just gone through major renovations. You can visit the magnificent Kranji Commonwealth War Grave, and as I said, the important thing is that was part of the Australian defensive position. And across the island, there are a number of museums, including Percival's Final Command Bunker, a museum at Changi, which has a replica of the chapel, which now exists in the grounds of the Royal Military College Duntroon, my alma mater in Canberra. And you also have the Ford factory, as I mentioned, and then a range of monuments throughout the country and battle markers. We saw one of the battle markers up there at Saremban Beach near Kranji. Here's another one, which is at the Labrador Battery. So a number of these famous coastal gun batteries in Singapore still exist, and you can go visit them. The Labrador Battery here was the one Professor Farrell referred to as supporting the Malay platoon beside the mosque at the start of his presentation. So, of course, in fact, I saw some questions come in, one from Scott about the circumstances surrounding the withdrawal of the 27th Battalion. In fact, I might just speak about some of the references in doing so. The withdrawal of the 27th Battalion, quite a controversial withdrawal. You've got to also realise that when some of these official histories were being written, that there was some influence on these by the original commanders and the war officers of some of the countries. So perhaps some of the more contentious aspects are treated fairly lightly. Professor Farrell, however, does not treat any guilty party lightly at all, and he talks about the downright negligence of Brigadier Maxwell in command of the 27th Australian Brigade up there at the Causeway, and some of the command decisions he made and then indeed tried to obscure post fact. So I'd recommend reading in detail Brian's book. That said, the Australian official histories are the official histories are fantastic. There's also an Indian official history developed collaboratively with the Pakistanis, which was quite a unique thing at the time. Brian speaks a lot about the nature of the sources available, which you can understand during a retreat. Many of the original records were lost, so the history of Singapore is far less clear than many other battles in the Second World War. Australian official history. There's the link to the website. You can get the entire thing. It's multi-volumes, all for free there. The Australian Army publishes its own campaign series books, which are generally excellent and quite brief, with excellent photographs and maps. And there's one co-authored by Professor Farrell coming out this year. And then you've got a couple of battlefield guidebooks, maps, such as the one that's been behind me the whole time. Wikipedia covers the campaign quite well, and there are some good documentaries on there, like Hell in the Pacific. And
now there's this one, Ross.
And indeed, we have World War II TV, which now covers the Malayan Campaign and the final battle for Singapore. So that's an important addition to the legacy, and definitely having people like Brian on the ground and Warren Officer Paul Knapp in the previous one really adds a huge amount. So just to conclude, unless we need to field any other questions, or you have any, Woody?
I just want to say that, like we talked about with the Malaya show, is that it seems to me is there's still reasons to study this battle. You know, we think we've got to grips with certain battles like Operation Market Garden, and basically it's a question of now deciding who your heroes and villains are. But with this, in terms of understanding leadership decisions, understanding use of terrain, you were teaching this until comparatively recently to serving officers. There is still more that we can glean from this, from that point of view, as well as just being interested in history in it for its own right. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I think much of the basics of the history are quite well understood. Again, those references cover it. Understanding how it all played out on the ground is a little difficult, and of course, good maps can help with this. The best being in the British official history. That's where most of those coloured maps came from. The Australian ones are a lot more small and black and white, but just as accurate. So it's not necessarily here about understanding the facts. And this is where it becomes really useful for particularly military officers. And we take a lot of soldiers there as well on an annual basis. And it's because there are so many lessons for modern war. You know, we're discussing things such as decision cycles, OODA loops, whether we choose an area defence or a mobile defence, what characteristics of the troops you need to pull off a mobile defence in difference to area defence, implications of training, reinforcement, even modern things for politicians, probably more so in the Battle of Hong Kong. But this idea of having a speed bump, a battalion or two in position to demonstrate resolve when a determined attack will overrun it and send hundreds of men to their death and captivity, still very controversial in Canada, for instance. And with modern day lessons, I won't say which conflicts or potential conflicts they might apply to, but it's a very good teaching battlefield, both in Singapore and numerous ones in Malaya. So that's why I think there's a lot of value to continue trying to understand the fighting here.
And as we said, your contact details and that of Brian Farrell. Brian's less on Twitter. You're busy on Twitter, but people can get in touch with you. We can start a dialogue going. And definitely, I think it's worth exploring this campaign in greater detail in the future. I'm not done with it. I think we should be done with it today. 2 hours is enough, I think, but brilliant stuff. But I just want to add, that again, folks, tomorrow morning we have Stuart Lloyd coming on, continuing the story of the Alexandra massacre, because of course we covered it, and Stuart's watching. We set it up very well with the campaign, but there's a lot more detail to that story that we're going to explore tomorrow. So again, folks, tomorrow's show is a different time of day than my normal shows, and then later in the week things get back to normal again. But it is a bit of a weird schedule over the next few days when I'm dealing with time zones and what have you. But right now, I think we'll bring things to an end, Ross. I think we've covered everything. I want to say thank you very much for being part of this, and again, thank you, Professor Farrell, for sending those clips. It's been really good. So I hope we meet up again for a Guinness or something in Bayer at some point in the future, or I come to you or whatever. But that will be really good. I look forward to that.
Yeah, thanks a lot again for the opportunity, Woody, and look forward to doing more and obviously meeting you again. And of course, there's a lot of history to see in Eastern Europe or Central Europe, depending on where you go. That's also worth covering, and some parts almost equally as unknown as the Battle for Singapore in Malaya.
I just have, we have had questions about how good was Yamashita and how good was Bennett and that, but I think we'll end up going down a long deep rabbit hole that we can't get up. We shall come back and discuss those figures later. I think it's worth doing. And also, we haven't discussed any great level. Thank you very much. What you did do, the naval aspect, we could bring Drakeni Fell or Alexander Clark on and talk about the loss of the repulse and what have you, because that's another important aspect about how the naval plan comes in. So I think a panel discussion about Singapore will be worth doing at some point. I'll get that in the diary. But right now, I think we will bring things to an end. So thank you very much, everybody, for watching. As usual, don't forget to support what we're doing on social media. Consider becoming a patron or a YouTube member. But basically, I will see you all again tomorrow. So cheers, everybody. This is Paul Woodadge saying enjoy the rest of your weekend. Cheers. Bye.